Let's talk about declarative data fetching in React. So we have a small fetch button here. The button is not doing anything for now, but what we want to do is when you press a button, we want to fetch some data and then display it on the screen. We already have a fake fetch button here, fake fetch function. Now, whether you use hooks, local state, global state, reframe, or any other state management library, it doesn't really matter. The data flow, like the general flow, is always more or less like that. You have a view, the user initiates some kind of an action, the action triggers an effect. In our case, this is data fetching, and then the result of the effect, which is likely to be some piece of data, is going to be stored in a local state or in a global state, in some kind of state, and that state will be displayed on the screen. So here, when you press a button, we would call the fetch function, right? And then, since it's a promise, it will resolve to a value, which is a vector of 3 numbers here. And now we want to store it somewhere. So let's call a function called setState, and then we'll introduce a local state. And then, for the sake of visualizing an empty state, we'll put a keyword here. And then we can go and render a div with a stringified value of the state, right? So now if we press fetch, in a second, this resolves to a vector. Nice. Okay. Let's say now that you want to fetch the data immediately when the app loads and component renders. So now we don't have any of the user input because the condition that triggers the effect fetching is going to be the page load, for example, right? Or application startup. So in this case, we can use a use effect hook. Right, it takes a callback, it takes an array of dependencies, and then we can basically move the fetch call here. Now if I reload the page, you can see that it's nothing, and then it resolves to a vector. So great, this works. But now let's say that we have a separate piece of UI that, like, it's doing its own thing, but then we decide that whatever state that is driving that other piece of UI also needs to affect how we fetch data. Maybe based on the value in the input field, we want to refetch data in this component and show something else. Like maybe that's a type ahead. When you put value in a input field and you're like in real time, you're hitting the backend and searching for, I don't know, like your Google Maps API or something. So let's rename this component to something like section and reintroduce the app component as our root component. And here we will render the section component. And then I will introduce a local state that will track a value of the input field. Right, we'll start with an empty string. And then we'll have an input here. And when the value in the input changes, we will take a value of it and update local state. And then we will put the value back. So this way we're making a controlled input, maybe because we want to also have some kind of validation, right? We can say this input is, or this value is only valid when, for example, the number of characters is more than 3 characters, right? So we can say border color when it is valid, or when not valid, it's going to be red. Yeah, just like that. Let's see. Yeah, what I have here. So yeah, the input field by default is empty, so it's going to be invalid. But if I put more than 3 if I put more than 3 characters, then it's black, which means it is valid. So what I'm demonstrating here is that, like, there is a piece of self-contained UI with its own logic, with its own state, with its own component. And now I decide that I want to use the value from the input field to drive something inside of section component. So let's pass the value into the section component, right? And maybe we actually want to pass it only when the value is valid, right? And now, based on the value, we want to refetch the data. So again, it's not going to be user input that triggers the effect. It's not going to be a page load or application start that triggers the effect. In this case, it's going to be the value that triggers an effect. So we are declaring the UI, we're passing some arguments, and we want to be able to express what's gonna happen based on the value. So we have declarative UI, and now we're doing declarative effects. And useEffect is the thing that allows us to do that. So the second argument to useEffect is a vector of dependencies. This is basically a vector of values that an effect will track, and whenever they change, useEffect will rerun the callback. So we can say that, hey, useEffect, please subscribe this function to the value. And because we know that the value is going to be nil when it's not valid, we can check that whenever value is here, we want to fetch the data. Or in this case, because we still want to fetch data on application start, we actually don't need this condition, right? But now if I reload, it's still gonna fetch. So for the sake of demonstration, let's still have this condition here. So now you can see that the input is invalid, no value is passed into the section component, nothing is fetched. Now if I put more than 3 characters, you will see that the component fetched the data and updated its local state. So this is a silly demonstration, but I think it's a very good one. It just shows you how you can encapsulate the logic, like the effect handler, the local state, the view, everything inside of the component, and still drive what's happening inside of that component from the outside using data.